Hello, welcome to the lecture, the webinar on supporting the literacy development of Hindi and Urdu language learners from theory to practice. My name is Tasha Darbes and I am an instructor at NYU STARTALK and I will be giving the presentation for you. So to provide an overview, today we will learn how to support the literacy development of learners of Hindi and Urdu. We will keep in mind that the learning of these languages takes place in very complex social and linguistic contexts. So to further support learning, we will review important theories related to language learning and literacy, and also think about how to apply these theories to create effective instructional supports. So to begin, I want you to think about the following question, which is, what does it mean to know more than one language? We can think of this as an easy question, but actually once we start to think about it, how we define knowing a language is actually quite complicated, as those of us who know more than one language can do different things in different languages in different contexts. So I'd like you to take a minute to map out how your languages have developed over time. And to give you an example, here's my chart. So over here, we can see that there is this axis, which refers to how proficient I am in a language, and here we have time from birth all the way to adulthood. And I can somewhat speak 3 languages: English, Spanish, and Russian. If we look at my English line, which is blue, I grew up as a monolingual English speaker, so I learned English, was exposed only to English from birth, and over time my English has developed exponentially, probably between the ages of 0 to 5, and then through schooling it continued to develop and is now my dominant language. I learned Spanish beginning around the age of 14, and it has continued to develop, and since I continue to use it, I'm quite feeling comfortable, but of course I'm not as proficient in Spanish as I am in English. And I also started to learn Russian in college, and I began to improve, but now that I don't use it very much, I've forgotten a lot of what I've learned, and so the line of proficiency has actually decreased over time since I don't use it anymore. So take a minute and copy down this chart and think about the languages that you speak and how they have developed over time, and make your own chart. So here's a sample of what we call a simultaneous multilingual language development. I'm what's called a sequential language learner, which means that I learned language a little later. When we say simultaneously, it means that the person was exposed to multiple languages from an early age, usually before the age of 5. So in this person's chart, we can see that this person knows Punjabi, Hindi or Urdu, and English. You can see that from birth to 5, there was actually exposure to all of these languages. Over time, though, the line for Hindi or Urdu has increased and become the dominant language. English has continued to develop. Punjabi started to hold steady at one age, but then has started to decrease over time. In this example of a simultaneous bilingual, we see another example of what's called language attrition. Language attrition means that you actually forget the language. We sometimes underestimate that language proficiency, or the development of language, doesn't always go up in a straight, continuous line. It can sometimes decrease over time because of lack of use or exposure, and then increase again. So in this example, we see somebody who was a simultaneous bilingual because there was exposure before the age of 5. These languages developed, but at some point, usually around the time of schooling, exposure to schooling, one language such as Hindi or Urdu starts to decrease or suffer from attrition, whereas English, in this person's case, has continued to develop over time. So as we can see from these three examples, when we look at multilingual or bilingual development across time, it is a complex process that depends on many factors. Some of the most important factors are age. And when I say age, I usually mean the age that you have initial or extensive exposure. So when someone learns more than one language prior to the age of 5 or so, as I said, this is considered to be a simultaneous bilingual. After that, a person such as myself, I was exposed to Spanish and Russian as a teenager, I would be considered to be a sequential bilingual, which is you learn one and then you learn another. There are differences that we'll need to keep in mind in terms of instruction between simultaneous and sequential multilinguals. Another factor that's extremely important for language learning is exposure, which is how are you learning the language? How are you exposed to it, either through oral communication or written? So it is how are you exposed? What was the context of your exposure? And also, how long? How long have you been exposed to that language, and were there any breaks or gaps in the exposure? And the last one, obviously there are more factors that influence language development, but one of the more important ones that will impact our thinking about teaching is the person's exposure to schooling in that language, which is how long you received actual instruction in the language, especially literacy. So when we think about our students, these are the three most important factors that we consider when we are understanding their development, and as well as our own. So let's go back and review the language development graphs. Which graph do you think could represent a speaker who immigrated to the US as a young adult? Which graph do you think could represent a child of an immigrant born in the United States? And how are you making your decision when you look at those language proficiencies over time? What do you think is impacting why some of the languages sort of go up or down across time? Let's take a look. So in the first example of a simultaneous multilingual language development that we thought of, I would say this one is very representative, or sometimes representative, of someone who immigrated as a young adult. We can see that the exposure to multiple languages happened at a young age, but that this person, because they grew up in a country other than English, the language of exposure and schooling, and the language that therefore became dominant, was Hindi or Urdu. This person probably had a home language. For example, their parents might have spoken another language as well in the home, or they may have had other kinds of exposure to Punjabi. While this exposure was happening, it developed, but then at some point the exposure decreased, or there was not access to schooling, and so this proficiency began to decrease. Whereas if this person immigrated to the United States and had some extra exposure to English at some point in time, we can see that the English starts to grow and develop, and at some point becomes perhaps more dominant than Punjabi. In this case, this is an example of what can happen with sometimes with children who are born here and whose parents speak a language other than English. It could be any language. In this case, we put Urdu or Hindi. We see that the child gets exposure to both languages in the home. However, once they hit school age and start to have more exposure and schooling in English, English starts to become the much more dominant language. And in some cases, this dominance can start to affect their proficiency in other languages that were spoken in the home. And this line has the danger of decreasing if the child does not have any exposure or instruction in the other language. So we call this, even though we can see on the graphs, we represent those languages as separate lines. Actually, many theorists or people who think about language development point out that languages are interdependent, which means that they don't sort of progress as separate lines, but they influence each other over time. So we can't really understand languages as separate systems. We call this linguistic interdependence, or sometimes it's called the common underlying linguistic proficiency. What this means is that in bilinguals or multilinguals, the development of one language potentially bolsters or helps the development of the other, and vice versa. It also means we need to remember that skills or abilities that are understood or acquired in one language are transferable between language systems. So, for example, if I know how to do something in English with language, I can transfer that skill when I learn Russian or Spanish. This is especially important when we consider literacy practices. If a student has strong literacy in one language, these practices transfer to the other and result in easier acquisition of literacy and higher performance, especially if the teacher knows this and takes advantage of this. So here is a graphic that illustrates what we mean by common underlying proficiency. It's sometimes called this iceberg model of language interdependence. We call it an iceberg because we sort of think, oh, I have these two separate languages, for example. I have English and Spanish, or perhaps you have Hindi and English or Urdu and English. And we can see that these would be the performances of one language and the performance of another, and we think of them as being separate. But underneath that are skills and abilities that transfer below the water between the two visible icebergs. And when we think about what we mean by this, what's common or what's underlying in the system, these are things like the ability to decode letters or other kinds of literacy skills, understanding about how language works, and understanding how to do certain things like read or write. All of these things can transfer between languages underneath the surface. So I want you to take a moment, perhaps you can pause the presentation and just think, what literacy skills are transferable between the languages that your students are learning or that they know? Of course, these literacy skills will differ depending on the age of the students who you teach and the other factors that we develop, such as the age of acquisition and their exposure to schooling. Let's think a moment about the particular situation of what we call heritage students, which are very much like that slide of the children of immigrants who are exposed to the languages that their parents speak in the home and learn the language through their use in community and family situations usually. If we think about heritage students, what are the possible combinations about their literacy and the home language that they speak, which could be Hindi or Urdu? For example, what is their literacy level of English? We can think about skills like decoding. Can they decode the alphabet? Decode means that when you see a letter, you know what the sound is that's connected with that letter, and you can apply it to sound out words that you don't know. Can they write simple and complex sentences in one language or another? Can they read and write both personal and academic texts? So as we know, sometimes students or learners may be able to do one or not the other. We can also think about that in terms of their other home languages. Can they understand or produce sounds that are different in Hindi and Urdu or English? Can they speak and understand personal communication, like what we call, kind of daily, everyday language? Can they speak and understand academic or context-specific communications? For example, could they read a textbook? Could they read an article? Could they read a piece of literature? Now, what does all this mean for the teaching of literacy? Now that we've reviewed some important concepts from theories of language development, let's think about the implications for when we're actually having to instruct students in literacy skills and language. We can sort of think about these questions. How do we design literacy instruction to meet the needs of learners with these complex language histories and development? How do we design literacy instruction that takes linguistic transfer into mind? And what are some implications that are specific to those who speak Urdu or Hindi at home? Now, there are various approaches to developing literacy. And a lot of times when I work with teachers, and anybody really, when we think about how do we become literate, how do we learn the skills related to reading and writing, we often go back to the way we ourselves were taught. So think a moment, what do you remember about how you learned how to read and write the languages or that you speak? I know for myself what I sometimes notice is that we remember things like, how to sound out letters, or writing the letter and saying the name of the letter. Those are the kinds of things that we often think about when we remember back to how we were taught, because that's what we remember about our classroom. But if I really think about it, the way that I myself learned how to read in English a lot of it was through having stories read to me by my parents. And I would memorize the books. I had certain favorite books, and I memorized them so that I could actually say them without them telling me. And after a while, I made an association between what was read and the word that was printed on the page. So those two different ways of thinking about literacy, we can describe those as either bottom-up approaches, which is that you start with the sound and letters and work your way up to sentences. So when we say, or top-down, which is that you start with language as a whole in context and work your way down to the individual components. So let's think a little bit more about what these two approaches mean. So bottom-up approaches are those that I mentioned first. That's usually what comes to mind when people remember how they were taught to read. Thinking about letters and sounds of letters. So these are approaches that include things like teaching each letter or sound in a sequence. We can think about, like, this is the letter A. What sound does the letter A make? These are also activities that have you focus on smaller pieces of information, like having students circle the letter in a word or copy letters. And it is also how you teach learners to sound out a word that they know or have heard. So like you give them a word and you say cat, and you have them sound out k, at, in order to write the three letters C-A-T. These approaches are very common, but they are only effective in certain situations. These approaches work best when you have younger learners who are still working on sound letter connections in English and Hindi. So these approaches were really made or developed to address the needs of teaching young learners how to make the connection between the k and this letter C. And and bottom-up approaches that focus on these small bits of information are very useful there. However, there are some issues with bottom-up strategies when we think about bilingual learners. Bottom-up strategies assume you already know the phonemic system or the sounds of the language that you're learning. However, the phonemic systems of English and Hindi or Urdu are different. Students can therefore get confused by bottom-up strategies if they are still developing just the basic sounds. Like if you can't recognize a sound, then you have a hard time making that sound letter connection. In that case, they would need extra focus on the sounds that are different in the two languages. So let's say a teacher is trying to if we use English as an example, if we are trying to teach Hindi to an English speaker, they're going to have a really hard time with certain sounds that are different in English and Hindi. For example, in American English, we tend to pronounce the letter P as an aspirated sound, which means that there's a bit of a puff of air, a little huh after it. Like I, as a native English speaker, would say party, or I would say people. I don't know if you can hear that puff of air. However, in Hindi, they make a distinction between a a p and a b, and they might say something like bani instead of pani. So those sorts of sounds would need to be focused on if we were thinking about using bottom-up strategies. If we think about written systems, what do the written systems of English and Hindi or Urdu have in common? And what is different? What sounds would be difficult for English speakers? Other sounds would be difficult for English speakers to identify and produce. And the reason I'd like you to think about this is we want to go back to that idea about skills transfer and what kinds of skills are common and which ones are different. If we think about common skills, well, the fact that sounds and letters are connected, that's a skill that can be transferred. If we think about the fact that in some languages, sounds and letters are not connected. We also have a lot of sounds and sounds that are similar that could transfer easily. So think about also what is different. There are a few more issues that we can think about when we use bottom-up approaches for literacy. Older students who already have literacy skills in English can transfer those skills to the learning of Hindi or Urdu, and therefore they will become bored with too many isolated literacy activities. So this means if they've already made that connection, they already have that skill that a sound is connected to a letter, then they don't really need practice with that. And they can they can transfer their skills of English into and absorb the learning of the Hindi script and the Urdu script much faster and without isolated activities. So for these students, it is better to develop literacy in context. Use visuals for students who don't know spoken Hindi well. Use real-life familiar conversations or modeled language for students who know spoken Hindi or Urdu. You can also provide support that allows students to gradually gain independence with script. Instead of Google Translate, give them a handout that makes them look for the letters or sounds that they don't know. And apps and games are especially useful in these situations. Top-down approaches are very common in U.S. classrooms for younger learners, but as I said, they're common, but teachers of language learners don't often apply them effectively in language classrooms. So top-down approaches are what I was talking about when I remembered how I learned to read from my parents reading stories to me and me memorizing them. They're basically things like reading stories aloud and pointing to words as you read. They are things like giving students sight words to memorize as a whole so that they see the word as a whole picture rather than the individual elements of the letters. There are things like providing a whole word or sentence and having students fill out what is missing. Activities that ask students to use their knowledge of the language to decode or predict what they are reading. And activities that focus on making meaning rather than isolated skills. There are issues with top-down approaches just like there are issues with bottom-up. Top-down approaches work best when students already know the sounds and have basic competency in the language. They can use this knowledge to predict what they need to do to make meaning. This makes this approach very effective for heritage learners who have at least novice high proficiency in speaking. If you want to use top-down approaches for learners who are below novice high in speaking, the language needs to be modeled orally before you apply them. But they work very well with heritage students who are already somewhat fluent and can use their knowledge of the spoken language to guess or to make inferences about how they can, what the literate language looks like and how it works. So here's a few examples, suggested activities to support early literacy. I understand that one challenge of teaching in heritage language contexts especially is the fact that sometimes students don't have very much exposure to the language in the written form. And therefore, teachers sometimes don't know how to balance making activities that are comprehensible to the students, but still ask them to use or understand literacy so that their literacy is growing and developing simultaneously with their oral proficiency or their proficiency in speaking and listening. So here's some examples of activities that are appropriate for those who may be more fluent in speaking than in their literacy skills. One activity that I'll show you is called dictation or disappearing conversation. Things like storyboards, where there are multiple ways that a student can tell a story, and you can differentiate or make the activity different for different kinds of proficiency levels. Another technique is something called sentence starters or sentence frames. Basically, this is that you start a sentence with a phrase and then expect the student to fill out what's missing. It helps to guide their learning. Using things like word banks. Word banks are when you give a handout and you give the vocabulary that they need in a box at the top. This is a very good scaffold for those who have early literacy issues, because then they can copy or identify the word rather than expecting them to sound out and write the word all by themselves. Things that have them focus on missing letters or missing words. And also the use of visuals to support the learning of vocabulary. I always caution against having the students use Google Translate too much. It ends up becoming a crutch, especially when they're writing. They often then just copy-paste rather than use the skills that they have and transfer those skills into their learning of Hindi or Urdu. So you need to think about, if you're not going to have them use Google Translate, how will you have them actually write? So to give you just a few more specific examples, here's an example for a way that you can focus on the skills of letter recognition or early decoding that is appropriate for younger learners. And as I said, we're always trying to think about what the needs of our learners are, what do they know, what do they not know when we are choosing activities. So for this activity, I'm thinking about, well, these are younger learners that are still developing their literacy skills, their underlying proficiencies, as we say. So it's okay then to use something more of a bottom-up approach, where you have them focus on smaller bits of information and then move up. So in this activity, we can see that in the coloring sheet, there are words in different boxes that have different vowel sounds in English. So long vowels like I and A and E would be colored green. Short vowels like red and pan would be colored orange, and any words that have R in them, like third or porch, they would be colored blue. And once the students have colored in all of the papers using their knowledge of how vowels sound, they would get a nice picture. So I want you to think about, how would you be able to adapt this kind of activity to Hindi or Urdu? What kinds of words could you put in those spaces, or what kinds of sounds would go together that would help them just focus on recognizing letters and making the connection between letters and sounds? Think about it. Here's another activity that I think is useful for kind of modeling language learning for those who have some understanding of spoken language but need support in written language. So this kind of activity supports a number of skills, including how to sound out a word that you recognize from listening. This is good for heritage learners who understand spoken language but are lower in literacy. You may know what the word sounds like, but you're not sure how to write it out. It's also good for developing vocabulary and or grammatical understanding. But as we usually do in STARTALK, we don't like to focus on just grammar or vocabulary separately. It always needs to be embedded in real life or meaningful conversation. So in the disappearing conversation, you begin with a conversation. I would say that this activity would be appropriate for the novice level. And you could teach this conversation. You could have them practice it in pairs. They wouldn't have to necessarily even learn it through reading it. They could probably, a short conversation like this with a lot of repetition could be taught as a separate activity. And as you can see, this is a conversation about asking what kind of water you would like, or if you're thirsty and asking for a drink. So this is something that the teacher could model. You could have the students practice as an oral or listening activity, but then you could then take the next step of having them transfer their understanding of this conversation to literacy and write this conversation out on the board with letters. In a disappearing conversation, what would happen is you would then have them read each sentence that they've probably already practiced or learned through speaking, and then the words that are highlighted, words like pias or paani or bara or ka, you could, if you had an old school chalkboard, erase those words and see, have the students close their eyes. You erase them, you have them open their eyes, and then you have them guess or see if they can remember which word did you erase, which one is missing. And you would repeat this over and over again with different, erasing different words until they can repeat all of the conversation and also be able to identify all of the words, how they look when they are written down. So you can see here, this would be an example of what the board or the handout would look like once it starts to disappear. When I used to do this activity, I would take out a few words. Maybe I would take out all of the nouns, take out all of, in this case, postpositions, or you could take out all of the verbs, all of the be verbs, for example, and see if they can remember where they go and remember how to write them. And at the end, you would actually erase the whole conversation. Everything would go. And then you would have the students see if they could write out the whole conversation themselves without the support of the blackboard or the PowerPoint screen or whatever you are using to provide the input. So this is an example of how you move from a common spoken conversation and have them focus on literacy. And you can support even very early literacy students to transfer their knowledge of speaking to their knowledge of reading and writing. For those students who are, or those learners who have higher literacy skills, once they are fluent in decoding, once they know how to sound out words that they are familiar with, then literacy instruction can support higher literacy skills. So I always want to keep in mind that literacy is not just about learning the alphabet. It's not just about being able to write words down. Literacy skills also include things such as storytelling, how to write a good story, expository writing, like creating explanations, creative writing, like poetry or songs. It can be writing reports and essays based on content, or things like, producing texts related to science or social issues or issues that are important to their community. And also multimedia presentations. We don't just think about literacy as being restricted to the written word, but it's also a certain type of literacy to be able to produce a video or to make a poster, and what is called visual literacy or multimedia literacy. So to support these skills, teachers can focus on templates, guiding questions, models, and complex sentence structure and vocabulary. So in conclusion, the development of literacy for learners of Urdu and Hindi takes place in complex social and linguistic conditions, and teachers need to be aware of the abilities and needs of their learners across their multiple languages of their students. Teachers need to know how to support the literacy learning of those who have lower literacy in Hindi and Urdu than perhaps their speaking and listening skills. And we have discussed some concrete ways that you can do this. teachers can use the underlying proficiencies to transfer to the learning of Hindi and Urdu. So we need to see what students' abilities are as resources that we build on, instead of ignoring them and focusing more on kind of rote learning. We can use those literacy skills and transfer them to the learning of new skills. And literacy can play a role in the development of language, and teachers should be able to integrate literacy into meaningful communication and language learning. Thank you.